In 1882 were born several remarkable people, among them James Joyce, James Stevens, Igor Stravinsky, Georges Braque, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and very much a center, source, and support of the ideas and actions of these people and others, which to a great extent simultaneously created and articulated both our modern world and our way of thinking about it. Virginia Woolf, a writer of not only cutting-edge fiction, but also of unconventional political ideas, full of hope's and democracy's edge. In the early to mid-1970s, budded the ideas, writings, and actions of another generation, people born in the mid to late 1940s. As with the 1882 generation, many of this later one not only knew of each other, but were actually acquainted. These times of kairos doubtless occur always. We just do not always get to know about them. Luckily for us, in our time, we are able to enjoy and benefit from the ideas and works of the later generation, of the 1882 generation. At the same time, we were able to enjoy and benefit from the particular later generation I have mentioned, which helps us better to value what is happening now. Moreover, many of us in this room or participating via the wonders of technology have also had the good fortune and great pleasure of experiencing the creation and its effects of the more democratic and healthy world, being forged by these thinkers, writers, and activists, among them the speakers we have heard today and yesterday. Salient and tasty examples of the kairos which I mentioned include the facts that in August 1971, in Berkeley, California, Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse, the very month that Frances Moore Lappé's book, Diet for a Small Planet, first saw light of day, also in Berkeley. In 1977, Molly Katzen published the Moosewood Cookbook and has gone on, as have Waters and Lappé, to become not only household names, but also women who have changed the way we eat and the way we think about food and its production. I first read Diet for a Small Planet when the revised edition came out in 1975. Seeking to reward myself with a break from studying for comprehensive exams, I sought and bought the book, took it home, fixed a cup of tea, curled up, and began reading. When I emerged 2 days later, I exclaimed repeatedly to everyone I met, and I think a lot of people in this room have had this experience, "You have to read this book. This is one of the most important books written in this century. The writer deserves both the Nobel Economics and Peace Prizes and probably others as well. You have to read this book." Thus began my long, avid, delighted education about such profoundly important matters through observing the career of one of the most important thinkers of our times, a public intellectual whose work, like that of the 1882 generation, has shaped much of her and our culture for the better. And like her counterpart, Virginia Woolf, Frances Moore Lappé remains central to the ideas and works of so many who seek to create and sustain living democracy for all. In this country, in the early 1960s, Julia Child showed us how to eat more enjoyably, and Adele Davis continued to show us how to eat more healthily. In the early 1970s, Frances Moore Lappé showed not only US families, but also families worldwide, how to eat enjoyably and healthily, and how to do so without using a greatly unfair, unjust proportion of the world's resources. This is indeed the pinnacle paradigm of having one's cake and eating it too. Lappé's research and her effective persuasion led her to a lifelong career of making food good. Her approach combines a multifaceted and nuanced vision for social and environmental transformation through realistic, proven, achievable practices in food production and delivery systems. As she works to reframe limiting ideas of scarcity, power, and democracy to free citizens to create living democracies, turning our planet toward life, as a quote, She significantly helps enable thousands of people in many cultures also to be good, the results of which help sustain our planet and increase the dignity as well as the lives of many people, a reality which in turn counters and begins to eliminate war. Born in Oregon, growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, graduating from Earlham College, pursuing graduate studies at Berkeley, and subsequently living most of her career when not traveling the globe in New England, have surely contributed to Ms. Lappé's worldview and her ability so effectively to engage so many and various peoples. From Diet for a Small Planet, the research and writing of which first alerted the world to ways in which we could disprove the myth of scarcity, to the new diet, Hope's Edge, and subsequent works, such as You Have the Power, Choosing Courage in a Culture of Fear, Democracy's Edge, Choosing to Save Our Country by Bringing Our Democracy to Life, Liberation Ecology, Reframing 6 Disempowering Ideas that Keep Us from Aligning with Nature, even our own, and Getting a Grip 2, Clarity, Creativity, and Courage for the World We Really Want. Frances Moore Lappé has continued not just to teach us, but to model for us most effective ways to live so that all peoples on the planet may not only survive, but also flourish. For her writing, teaching, and modeling, Ms. Lappé has received many awards and honors, including the James Beard Foundation Humanitarian of the Year Award in 2008, and the International Studies Political Economy Section Outstanding Public Scholar Award in 2009. In 2003, she received the Rachel Carson Environmental Advancement Award, and in 1987, Lappé became the 4th American to be awarded the alternative Nobel, the Right Livelihood Award. Many of the world's most famous food activists attribute to Ms. Lappé great inspiration for their own efforts to help all peoples to eat more healthily and with dignity and pride, not only in providing for themselves and their families, but also for their communities and ultimately for the global population, a pride which comes greatly from awareness we are doing less harm to others and to the planet. The work of our generation and that of those whom we teach continues to bloom, to propagate, bringing not only to the U.S., but also to the entire planet, both hope and education about how to put that hope into achievable action. From public school gardens to global fair trade and sustainable farming practice to delicious cuisine made of good food, the sort we have been discussing the past 2 days. We all benefit from the thinking and activism of this generation. As Virginia Woolf's articulation of her transformational vision, one which sought to prevent war and was central to the efforts of her generation to help create a better world, Frances Moore Lappé's vision, writing, and activism is central to our generation's efforts to sustain our planet and help all peoples live not only well, but also good. 35 years ago, I proclaimed that Frances Moore Lappé should receive both the Economics and Peace Nobel Prizes and probably others as well. While I still hope that Ms. Lappé is thus recognized and honored, along with our other guests. At this moment, it is Lappé who honors the Nobel name by participating in this conference and teaching us more about how, through living democracy, we can make food good. Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. I can say that actually you all have made me feel like I've really won those prizes. I feel like I've experienced something I can only call a masterpiece in learning in community. And I congratulate all of you. You have set a very high bar now for any future gathering of this sort. It is truly a work of art that you have allowed me to share in. And I know that you've been thanked many times, but I believe you can never be thanked too much for what you've done. So first, Chuck, Niederreiter, President Ole. Ole. I knew I could get it. We're even now, right? We're even. That was not intentional. Lisa Helke, Deborah Downs-Myers, Susan Krantz, each of you have contributed with grace, with expertise, to making me feel extremely welcome and giving me what I feel has been a most intense educational experience. So, before I really get started, this is a lot of wind-ups here, right? But I wanted to just give you my twist on this theme of making food good. And what first arose in me is that, for me, my twist is that food has been a good teacher, the best teacher. That I was so fortunate as a 26-year-old, some intuition said, oh, if I just follow food, maybe I can make sense of the world. If maybe I could understand why hunger, that seems pretty basic, then the mysteries of economics and politics would begin to unveil themselves. And so for me, food is the best teacher, and I just want to share that as how much I love the theme of this beautiful conference. So now to begin. I love to begin with the very apt words of the founder of Visa, who said, "It is far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism." And it's what I try to stay in, right? That despair is a luxury, one luxury that none of us can afford. So in that, then, if it's really too late for pessimism, then how do we avoid it? Especially, we've been vividly described some of the greatest problems on the earth in the last 2 days. So how do we do it? How do we avoid despair? And for me, first, and I assume for a lot of you, that I have to have a working hypothesis that I'm always working on, a theory about how we got into this mess. Because if I don't have a working theory, then how in the world am I going to get out? And I sort of feel like I'll just be grasping at what I call random acts of sanity, protest and charity, but ultimately random acts of sanity can lead to despair if you start looking at them and say, wait a minute, how does that actually reverse the forces that are taking us down? So my life has been a series of questions, of why questions. And they began, as you now know, with the question of why hunger. And then it was why hunger in a world of plenty. And so they just kept growing until maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the big question hit me. Why are we, this brainy species, together creating a world that not one of us would choose? It makes no sense. How can we possibly get our head around that? Because think about it. Not one of us gets up anywhere and says, yes, I want to make sure another child dies of hunger today. But 16,000 did. And nobody gets up and says, yeah, my job is to heat the planet. But we're doing so. So how can we make sense of the fact that we are creating a world that as individuals actually violates our most common sense and deepest sensibilities? And so, back to it. If not one of us actively is choosing this tragedy, then why? My answer, and this is all tentative, I want you to know, it's a working hypothesis, is that it's just that we feel powerless, too many of us do, feel powerless to do anything about it. That I've come to believe that it is our feeling of powerlessness, not global heating, not hunger itself, but our feeling of powerlessness. That's what we really have to worry about. And how can I say that? I can say that because I think that it's arguable, can be easily argued, that we either know the solutions now to most of these global problems, or they're right around the corner, because innovations every day are occurring. So, for example, take food. Sure, we know how to make a mess of it. We know how to turn food into such a health hazard that its cost in the U.S. is rivaling tobacco, disease from tobacco. But we know how to produce enough food. Today, there are about 20% more calories produced for each person on Earth, despite a doubling or more than population since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. 20% more food per person, and yet more hunger than ever in this last few years. So what I'm suggesting then is that we know how to get the production side right in terms of quantity, but we also know how to avoid the disaster we've created through chemical intensive agriculture that has created 400 dead zones in aquatic dead zones in oceans around the world, 400 of them. And that's just the beginning of the problem of the agriculture that we've been using, losing topsoil at 10 times the rate that nature can rebuild it. But even there, we know how to do it differently. The most interesting study I've seen recently, in 2007, an interdisciplinary study at the University of Michigan, concluded that if the entire world went toward sustainable agriculture, toward organic methods, that we actually could increase food production by as much as 50%. And there are other supportive studies similar, but this is a very large one. So we know how to do it right on the production side as well. So what about the consumption? What about ending hunger? Certainly there are parts of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, for example, where very, very close, if not there. And how many of you I'm very curious, how many of you are aware of what's happened in Brazil recently in terms of hunger? In the last 16 years, while hunger has been spreading through most of the world, has been increasing, that Brazil cut its hunger rate by about 50%. The southern Indian state of Kerala, which is resource poor, and where people live on about 5% of the per capita income of the United States, they have cut infant death, which is such a telling sign of hunger, cut it to 1/3 the all India average, and on other measures of well-being have begun to approach the global north in what they've been able to achieve on so little. And even here in the United States, I like to look back to the decade of the 1960s. In the 1960s, we cut the poverty rate in half here, making big strides against hunger here. So back to the why. So why aren't we jumping all over these and millions of other examples out there that are showing us the way, that we could, the exemplars from which we could learn? Why aren't we rushing there to learn as fast as we can? So I have to ask a more broad question then. What robs our species, we love life like every organism does, what robs us of our power to manifest what we know? What is it? And over the decades, I love getting old because now I can say over the decades. It gives me real authority, right? Over the decades, I've been taught by many great thinkers. One in particular I'm about to mention, who many of you, my generation, I point to my gray hair, will know this name, but I'll save that in 1 second. Over the decades, I've come to this hypothesis that the only thing powerful enough to rob us of our power to act on our common sense and many aspects of our soft-wired nature, which I'll get to in a second, the only thing powerful enough for the human species is the power of our minds, the power of ideas. I'm going to argue that ideas are more powerful than instinct. The power of ideas. And I just want to give you a homey example of this. Well, let me just say first that what I mean by that is that we see the world, we humans, we are creatures of the mind, we see the world through a lens. Anna and I in our book Hope's Edge call it our mental map, and we can't see what is outside of our mental map. We therefore see what we expect to see. In other words, the old saw, seeing is believing, has to be turned on its head. Believing is seeing. We see the world according to a belief system, a set of assumptions about ourselves and the world. And we can't see what doesn't fit there. So just a homey example of this, last Thanksgiving, I was all set to make my favorite root vegetable dish. And I had to find my favorite baking casserole, Dutch oven. And it's red. It's not inconspicuous. It's red. And I looked everywhere. I looked at cupboards. I looked at the basement. I looked everywhere. And I couldn't find it. So I said, okay, I'll try to think of something else to do. Gosh, I must have lent it to somebody, but am I getting that thought, forgetful? And about an hour later, I turned around, and there it was. Except it had a plant in it. You get my point. I was looking for a Dutch oven, not a planter. And really, it could have bit me, It was red, and I still didn't see it. So I laughed out loud because it's everything that I talk about, that we see what we expect to see, and I didn't expect to see a planter. So this is really the theme that I learned. A life-changing book for me was a book by Erich Fromm. This is the philosopher I was going to mention. In his book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Because in that book is a sentence that just has never left me. And he writes, "It is man's humanity that makes him so inhuman." And he describes what he means is exactly what I'm talking about tonight. It is the power of our ideas to create the world that can so limit us, or the opposite. Now, he would say, and I would agree, that this mental map problem is not a problem if we're alive at a time when the dominant map, because you see, we absorb these assumptions, these mental maps, like an invisible ether, largely unconsciously, and it's okay if we're alive at a time when they are fundamentally life-serving. But my hunch is that you and I, whatever generation, we share this moment of being alive when the dominant mental map that we've kind of begun to export globally is fundamentally life-denying. And that is a big problem. So, what is this mental map? I'll go right to it. I believe that what we absorb in this culture is a spiral of powerlessness that starts from the premise of lack. Not enough. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough energy, not enough food, not enough love, and in Boston there are certainly not enough parking places. And so I say there's not enough goods and not enough goodness, because we absorb the notion that fundamentally, if you peel away the fluff, what you can really count on about all human beings is that we are what? We are self-centered, we are materialistic, and we are competitive. And as soon as I say that, I kind of see this image of all of us elbowing each other out at the mall, right? But we believe that we can count on. The other things, yeah, they show up, they can be nice, but that's what we can really count on. Now, the problem is that because our minds are so powerful, if we believe that about ourselves, then yes, that does show up. And on this note, I just read the most amusing and alarming study in Scientific American. Very simple, I'll just explain. They divided people into two groups, gave them, each of them, these really fancy, expensive sunglasses, except to one group, they told them they were fake. They were knockoffs, the kind you can get for $3 in New York City on the street. And the other group, they said, oh, they're real. And then they put them through a battery of tests where it was really easy to cheat and to get ahead of the other guy. And guess what? The people who were, you're nodding, Rachel, the people who were wearing the fake sunglasses significantly cheated more. That I guess, if you're already a cheater, why not cheat? So but it did confirm for me this idea that I'm explaining tonight, that it's how we perceive ourselves is powerfully important. And if our culture is telling us that's who we are, that's who we are, just to some extent. So if we believe that, here's this spiral of powerlessness that's speeding around. So if we believe that, then, gosh, if we're just these selfish little shoppers, surely we can't come together and deliberate over, our common sense and our common sensibilities. We better find some sort of automatic way to sort it all out for us. And better if it's driven by something we can count on, our selfish nature. And that's what Ronald Reagan told us that we have. We have what he called the magic of the market. Hey, we're all set because we can turn over our fate to this magical force. Of course, the market we hit upon, markets have served humanity for eons of time, but we hit upon a peculiar notion of a market. And that is one essentially driven by one rule: what brings the highest return to existing wealth. So surprise, wealth accrues to wealth, accrues to wealth, until you have what in 2005, not I, but Citigroup said to us, we have a plutonomy, because the top 1% of wealth holders control 90% of the wealth in this country. Now, when I think of a number like that, it's just even hard to get your head around, but then I think, wait a minute, why didn't I catch on playing Monopoly with my brother? Billions of people have played Monopoly. And do you know that Monopoly was actually invented by a Quaker lady in the early 1900s to be an object lesson so we wouldn't do this thing? But it ended up getting to the hands of Parker Brothers, that is a total monopoly game company, so I guess she didn't get her point across. But in Monopoly, at the end of the night, my brother had all the property, and it was great because I could go to bed. But in real life, it's not so great because you're on the street. So that's the problem, that we end up then with such tightly concentrated wealth, 1%, 90%, that then it infuses, infects, and distorts our public decision-making, just what we need right now more than ever, a legitimate public decision-making representing our interest. So $16 million a day are spent on lobbying in Washington. More than 24 lobbyists for every single person that you and I have elected to represent us in Washington. And so even when there is wide agreement, we're told by the media that Americans are so divided. Actually, there's so much we agree on. So much we agree on. It was just one example. I read that a poll taken before the health care vote, that if you ask people about individual provisions in the health insurance reform law, there was tremendous agreement on them, and then if you called it Obama's health reform, they said, no, I hate it. But there is a great deal of agreement across our interests that is not allowed to express itself when we have so much influence in Washington because of this tightly held wealth that infuses itself. So here we are, to what I love to call privately held government. It should be an oxymoron, but it's getting to be more and more descriptive. And many people have warned us about this, but no one more eloquently than our president. In 1938, a joint session of Congress he addressed in April, and he said, "The liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I have to acknowledge I have not the courage to use the F word, except when I'm quoting an American president. But the point is that it is very disturbing. And so what I'm suggesting then, by taking us around this, starting with the premise of lack of goods and goodness, and then a lack of confidence in ourselves that comes from that, a willingness to give over our fate to an automatic force, believing that we can't come together to create a democratic market economy, leads then to the infection, the distortion of political decision-making that is then we end up then with reinforcing the premise, because what happens? What happens is that then we see embodied the very traits, for example, the Wall Street meltdown. We say, see, those guys, they behave greedily. And see, it just confirms we are really these selfish creatures. And from there, then, citizens feel alienated, they withdraw, they feel despairing. So that now, worldwide, depression is the leading cause of disability according to the World Health Organization. And suicides take 50% more lives than homicides. So this spiral of powerlessness could feel like a dead end because we're trapped then in feeling despairing about ourselves and about our capacity to come together to solve our problems. It could seem like a real dead end. But fortunately, I feel like I've really bummed you out now, but it's going up. Fortunately, yes, we human beings do see the world according to the mental map. But in moments of shock, when things are clearly not working, people do, and all of my books are sort of storybooks, and I tell stories about people who've had these moments when they said, oh my, the way that I put the world together just doesn't explain reality anymore. My example that comes to mind is Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who was walking during a famine in Bangladesh, walking to teach his course in economics as a professor, walking by people who were dying. He got to class and he said, wait, what does my economics have to do with the death of people who I passed by? I want to be an ignorant person again. I want to stop and, in effect, go back and ask the basic questions. And he left his position and he went to listen to villagers about why they are poor. And that was beginning of the microcredit movement, as you probably know. But that he had that moment of dissonance. And I think right now, a lot of us are having it. And it's a great gift. I think of it as a liberating whack. Things aren't working. Let's go deeper. Let's talk to people we've never talked to before. Let's read books we've never read and think in new ways. And when I say that, I think of Alan Greenspan with his big horn-rimmed glasses. When I could almost see them shattering, when he had to admit, after the financial crisis, maybe there was a flaw in how I thought that markets worked. But I don't know how much rethinking he's done, but I know we are capable of it because I've seen it over and over in people I love and I've experienced it. So for me, of course, it began, my first liberating whack was as a 26-year-old, realizing that while the newspaper headlines were telling us we'd run out of food, actually there was more than enough to make us all hungry. And then that wake up then allowed me to begin to question how we create the very scarcity that we fear. So what is emerging now and what wasn't there for us in 1969, 70, and 71 when I was doing my original work on Diet for a Small Planet, what's available to us and also what's in this invisible ether is a whole different way of seeing the world that we can all learn from. And certainly we've seen many rich pieces of it in the lectures that we've been treated to. And that is what I like to call, instead of a mechanical worldview, many of you are familiar with that term, when existence is seen as separateness and that we are these disconnected entities and that we are not, and that, for example, our social structures are something finished and done that we can just say, good, well, we were lucky enough to inherit one, a democracy. That what we are realizing with an ecological worldview is something very different. Because what ecology teaches first and foremost is relationship. That reality is formed moment to moment as we co-create with one another. We influence the other and we are influenced moment to moment, moment to moment. And so I love to quote my friend, the visionary German physicist Hans-Peter Dürer on this point. And he said, Frankie, there are no parts in an ecological worldview. There are only participants. There are no parts, there are only participants. I also recommend the work of Oxford physiologist Nobel in his beautiful book, The Music of Life. And he writes, In biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. There is rather a form of democracy involving every element at all levels. That's a physiologist speaking. So with this eco-mind is what I like to call it, then separateness becomes an illusion. This is critical to break free of the premise of lack of goods and goodness. The notion of fixed and finished and done are also fanciful because, as I say, from an eco-mind or with an eco-mind, we can see co-creation happening moment to moment. And the consequence of this worldview shift is huge. We move from paralysis and fear of divvying up a shrinking pie to a sense of possibility. So we move from the premise of lack to the premise of possibility. From that premise, then, we can see that just like every other organism in nature, we are shaped by our environment. And we can get a little bit smarter. And we can say, oh, if that's true, then what are the conditions proven to bring out our glorious pro-social elements? And what are the conditions that bring out the worst in us? And so we're able to recognize our rich complexity instead of just seeing ourselves as this shabby caricature. We're able to see that, yes, not a few bad guys, but most of us, under the wrong conditions, can behave cruelly. My most dramatic example of that, besides history itself, of genocides that continue to this day, is I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Stanford prison experiments, where they took young people who tested normal, put them in a mock prison setting, divided prisoner and guard. The experiment in 1971 was supposed to last 2 weeks, and Philip Zimbardo, the professor, had to stop it in 6 days because the guards were so brutalizing the prisoners. He said during the Abu Ghraib trials that the behavior was eerily similar to Abu Ghraib. And these are young people who tested normal. So with a relational lens, then we can say, okay, what else do we know? We know now that most of us, not a few of us, can behave very badly under certain conditions, which I'll get to in a moment. But something else has been going on since, since I've been on this planet. And some scientists have called it a revolution in understanding human nature in the positive dimensions of us. And I see this in psychology, in archaeology, in anthropology, and in neuroscience as well. And so what are they discovering? That we are, I like to call it soft-wired, not hardwired, because we have these potentialities that we experience every day. So I'll just quickly tick off what are these pro-social qualities that I think now we have to work with our ecological worldview, working on this relational understanding of life. What are the pro-social qualities we can enable to show up under the right conditions? I'll just mention a few of them. One, empathy, that we now know, and I'll describe this a little bit more in a moment, but we now know that in the 1990s in Italy, they discovered mirror neurons in our brains. So that when I'm doing this, there are actually neurons in your brain as if you were doing this. So imagine we experience each other moment to moment. Our empathy is not, yes, we can cultivate it, but it also is just a natural way of being. And of course, I like to think that we're at least as empathetic as the rhesus monkey. The rhesus monkey will go, bless their hearts, for up to 12 days without eating. If by eating they had to shock another rhesus monkey to get the food, they will, at least in one experiment, one rhesus monkey did this, but they would all hesitate to shock one another. But evidence from experiments can take us only so far, and then we have to have a life experience. So I have a 3-year-old grandbaby. When she was 2, actually, she would go to her dad, my son, and she would say, "Daddy, Daddy, are you sad?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Would you cry?" And so he'd pretend to cry so that she could comfort him. So what does that tell us? That she thought it was, really fun and pleasurable to express empathy. So Josie is my evidence. Number 1, okay, empathy, but then also cooperation. I love this. Neuroscientists at Emory University, looking at us when we're competing and when we're cooperating, learned that when we cooperate, parts of our brain are stimulated, the same as when we eat chocolate. I love that. And other, well, I've got to get going here. I won't tell you all my evidence here. But then also, third, fairness. We evolved in tightly knit tribes, knowing that breakdown of the rules and unfairness would probably dissolve us with the tribe. You know, our own preservation was dependent on the preservation of the tribe. So fairness and fair rules, that was critical. Also, I would argue that we would never have made it to almost 7 billion if we were couch potatoes, whiners, and basically, complainers. That we are doers, that we need to feel a sense of efficacy. That is who we are also. It's not just enough to have our hunger needs met, for example. We need to be players in the game. And when we're not, this is the global epidemic of depression, in my view. So I was interested in a long-term study of mortality rates in the UK that discovered that when all else was held constant as much as possible, that those people who had less control over their lives in the workplace had significantly greater risk of illness and earlier mortality. So actually, no, we do need, as Erich Fromm puts it, to make a dent. In fact, he went so far as to say we should reframe Descartes to say not I think because I am, but I am because I affect. So here we are then. We know that there can be this positive, we can build on these qualities, that we have what it takes to make this turn toward livable societies, flourishing societies. Now, to do it though, what do we need? We need to recognize that what happens when we can build on a culture of mutuality of the kind that we heard about from Dr. Paul Thompson today, and so many others, cultures of mutuality that we see now. And then we come to see with a sense of capacity focusing on these pro-social qualities, that we realize that we do not have to settle for the best democracy money can buy. And this, to me, is the most liberating news, because one of the best kept secrets in America is that there is a way to remove the power of money from the political process so that we can have our own voices heard. And indeed, I want to mention this to you, and I do not consider it just a wonky political bill. I think it is a food bill, too. And that is something called the Fair Elections Now Act. How many of you have heard of the Fair Elections Now Act? A number of you have. Last week made history. The House Committee on Administration passed it through to go to, hopefully, to the full floor. But this is part of the answer to creating the kind of democracy that can pull forth these positive qualities in us and keep the negative ones in check, because it would allow for voluntary public financing of elections, the kind of thing that has made history in 3 states already at the state level. In Maine, one can run for office and get public financing, so that my hero, Deb Simpson, for example, she was a waitress in the year 2000, a single mom with a high school education, and her friend saw leadership in her, and Deb was invited to run, and she said, "What? I can't run for office." She said, and her friend said, "Deb, you haven't been paying attention. All you need is $5 from 50 people. And she said, "Oh, I'm a waitress. I think I can do this." And she had the courage to do that, to run for office and to win, and has been reelected and has served as co-chair of the Judiciary Committee in Maine and been an outstanding leader on environment. So my point here is that it is possible that we can see that that we can get a democracy that is truly answering to our voices, and beyond that, we can begin to come up with new forms. A friend of mine who runs America Speaks in June, I don't know how many of you heard of this, but she brought together in, I believe it was 19 cities, 3,500 people who were given the task of trying to come up with an answer to our federal deficit problem. These were people selected scientifically to represent the broad cross-section of America and people of all persuasions politically, and they came up with a great deal of unity about how to do this, and their solutions that were then fed to this commission that has been created to help deal with the deficit. There's so many examples of these new ways to tap into citizen wisdom. And so what my suggestion is tonight is that the best news going is not simply that we have these inner strengths that we experience every day, but that we now know what are the conditions that bring forth the best and the worst. And we know it is possible to begin to move to a democracy that is answering to us, in which we can allow those pro-social qualities to show up. And so what do we know about what brings out the worst in us? Well, we certainly know that concentrating power does, extreme concentrations of power, as now we have the situation where one family, the Waltons of Walmart, control as much as 40% of the country's household population, 40% of the households in America, at the same time that half of American children will be on food stamps at some time in their lives. Concentration of power. Number two, known to bring out the worst in us, is anonymity. When you think of what happened on Wall Street, I learned from listening to radio interviews, I'm sure many of you have, that one of the slogans inside the traders who were slicing and dicing those risky mortgages was, "I'll be gone, you'll be gone. IBG, YBG," meaning that I'll be out of here when all the consequences start to show up, because they knew there was such lack of transparency about what was going on. So anonymity definitely doesn't bring out the best in us. And finally, the blame game, which is so stoked today. It's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. It is the opposite of what brings out the best in us. So what I'm suggesting then is it is no wonder that we are in the shape we are in, because we have manifested these three conditions known then to bring out the worst in us. But we also know that it is possible now to flip them, to reverse them. And that's what I think was so much described by several speakers during these glorious days with you, is that we know how to disperse power as we step up ourselves as truth tellers and as problem solvers. And I'm going to give you a number of examples of this. As we dissolve anonymity through face-to-face community and by rules that keep things open, and as we end the blame game by stepping up and becoming problem solvers and taking responsibility ourselves. So then, with these three guidelines of dispersion of power, of transparency, in part through face-to-face community, and mutual accountability, we begin to see the contours of living democracy emerging. And it's sort of the opposite of what our military in Afghanistan has called democracy in a box. It's the opposite of democracy in a box. It is democracy, as Paul Thompson was talking about, as a culture. So what does living democracy look like in economic life? It means re-embedding our economic life in our values as they have been throughout most of human history. And it means, for example, how did they do it in Brazil? They began to do exactly that, to embed the economy into values boundaries, is what I think of it. So several years ago, my daughter and I traveled to Brazil. We went to a city we were so intrigued by, because in 1993, they had declared good food, a right of citizenship. And we wanted to know what that meant. And we discovered that a Workers' Party mayor had been elected on this platform, and it did not mean longer soup lines. It meant bringing together all different parts of the community and brainstorming together and coming up with dozens of solutions, like inviting small organic farmers into the center of town and making a great market in the inner city available to them if they would keep their great produce in the price range of the poorest people. And so many other examples of this, keeping the market open. And for example, posting in the bus stops where you'd get the cheapest price of the 45 basic foods that people needed. Very simple, ingenious things. And at the end of our visit there, I got to talk to the woman who was a facilitator of this process. And I said, Adriana Aranja is her name. I said, Adriana, do you realize how out of step you are? That, the world is saying that the market can do no harm and government can do no good. And you're saying that we can come together and we can work together? And she went on in Portuguese, and I didn't understand a word of it. And I tried to be really patient, but then she started to tear up. And so I nudged the interpreter to interrupt her. And he told me that what was making her cry is that she said, yes, I knew how out of step we are, and I knew how much hunger there is in the world. What I didn't know, and what upsets me so, is how easy it is to end it. And obviously I'm tearing up now because I knew what she was saying. She wasn't saying her work was easy. She just said that once you are moving in this direction and trusting and having confidence in your neighbors and sitting down together and deliberating, that solutions are there. And I went back a few years ago, looked at the 10 years. They had reduced the infant mortality rate by 60% in Belo Horizonte, which is the fourth largest city in Brazil. Reduced infant mortality, an important measure of hunger, by 60%, and they had done it with 1% of the city budget. So this is something about what I mean by living democracy showing up in economic life. But at the level of the enterprise, I was so glad that Binet today, right, talked about the cooperative, the collectivity, she called them. So I can see then the power of the cooperative in at the enterprise level to bring democracy to life and to teach us a democratic culture. And often we think of cooperatives as kind of marginal, but actually if you look at the picture from here in the United States, where Organic Valley has gone from a handful of farmers in western Wisconsin to a national, still democratically run cooperative that is a $500 million business with something on the order of 1,400 farmers part of this cooperative, still working to bring the wealth back into rural communities across this country. And then I looked at India, and I realized that I love the stories we were hearing from Bino, and I learned that in India, that although we hear all about the high-tech jobs being created, that women in India have created 100,000 village dairy co-ops that are owned by 13.5 million villagers that provide about a fifth of the country's milk. And I calculated that they provide jobs about 6 times greater than the high-tech industry. And to put the cooperative power in perspective, cooperatives worldwide provide about 20% more jobs than do multinational corporations. And I've estimated conservatively that there are probably as many people who are members of co-ops worldwide as there are people who are owning shares in publicly traded companies. So on the food front as well, we can see what can happen. We can understand that there is tremendous potential for living democracy emerging as we recognize that large corporate industrial chemical agriculture is not the norm worldwide. Still, 1.6 billion peasant farmers, along with pastoralists and hunters and gatherers, as well as 800 million urban farmers, provide about 70% of our food today. So there's a lot to work with here, and where do we get the inspiration to see possibility? Well, I want to jump to Africa because as the reading that I am doing, so much of the focus is the mental map through which we're seeing is that Africa is a new basket case. Africa is where all the hungry people are, when actually Africa has, sub-Saharan Africa suffers a great deal of hunger, but in terms of numbers of hungry people, it is well less than half the number of South Asia. But nonetheless, we focus on Africa, so I want to for just a minute. It is considered the basket case, but what happens if we shift our lens and start looking at possibility? I'll just take a couple of countries. Niger. What do we hear about Niger now? We hear about famine in Niger. What we don't hear is that starting about 20 years ago, farmers started to look with new old eyes at trees. They'd seen them as a hazard because the French, who were their colonists, would punish people who did anything to the trees. So trees started being a hazard. But that frame started to change, and they started to see trees as something that would help hold the soil, help provide foliage for their farm animals, and help provide food for them. And so they started nurturing the tree stubs, and they started creating forest, but not so much forest as boundaries around their farms, and left many, many trees so that the soil began to restore itself. And as a result, one observer has said that perhaps this is the largest environmental restoration ever. 12.5 million desolate acres, now growing roughly 200 million trees. And so I talked to one of the people who has followed this, and I said, why haven't we seen this? And he said, people were just expecting Niger to blow away. It was so degraded. They were expected, and nobody thought to look at a regional level at this transformation happening. And so it was the mental map that blocked us from seeing possibility. And similarly, I see in relation to climate change how the kinds of changes that are happening in Niger is one example. I could go to north of Niger to Burkina Faso, where small farmers have started returning to these techniques that were used ages ago, small little indentations where 1,000 or so in a field, and they would then put a little bit of cow dung there. And so the rain would be held in these small little indentations called zai, and then the termites would come, and again the soil would restore itself, and they've been able in this very poor area, the most hardscrabble area of Burkina Faso, to double and even triple yields in a very wide area of 250,000 acres. So what I'm suggesting here is that with new eyes, we can begin to see what we had not seen before, and to see, in terms of climate change, the remarkable contribution that the shift from really valuing and encouraging this kind of bottom-up cooperative approach, whether formal or informal, that in fact this makes a huge contribution to meeting the climate change crisis. And you see, I'm sure you know that the climate change crisis has to do with the balancing of a cycle. It is both keeping more carbon in the soil and not releasing so much into the air. And with organic agriculture, it is predicted that about a third of if we really went all the way with this approach to agroecology, we could sequester a close to 30% in terms of the balancing act that has to happen. And with agroecology, we can do even more through this tree planting. So I'd like then to just end on a much, much more personal note here, because I want to go back to my original question. How do we keep from despair in this moment when the problems seem to be growing and we don't seem as a society and as a global society up to the problem, to having the problem-solving mechanisms of truly living engaged democracy up to the challenges? How do we keep going? And my suggestion is we start reminding ourselves that we are certainly good enough. We can drop this idea that we have to change our nature in any way, except that there's one piece of it I want to focus on that I'd like us to work on. I think we're good enough, but I think we need to work on our backbone. We need to work on the courage quotient. And here is the ironic, kind of intriguing challenge of this era, is that we evolved in these tightly knit tribes where we learned correctly that the scariest thing of all is to break from the pack, is to be banished from the pack, right? Because that was pretty certainly curtains. But now, jump to the 21st century, and the hyper-tribe is, as I visualize it, the hyper-tribe is heading over Victoria Falls. So breaking from the pack suddenly means life, not death, but it still brings up fear. So what do we do with that? We, in part, I think, what helps me a lot is to realize that even fear is in part an idea. It's an idea. Usually we think, oh, fear, that means we're in the wrong place, wrong time, better get out of there. You know, we think our repertoire is limited to freeze, fight, flee, right? That's what we learn. No, fear is in part an idea. It is maybe just energy. Maybe it's just information. Maybe it's telling us not that we're in the wrong place, but we're in exactly the right place, exactly at our edge, our growth edge. And I have to share with you a really corny trick that I came up with. Don't have time to explain the context, but doesn't matter. I know that when I get scared, what happens? You hear that thump? So it always happens when I'm really afraid I'm going to humiliate myself and say, and be excluded from the tribe. So this happened to me not too long ago, and I started my usual thing, which was, you wimp, what's your problem? Grow up, you're 66, you get over this. Instead, I reframed it as inner applause. And it made a huge difference. And I actually got my hand up in that circumstance. I wasn't called on, but I did, I did do it. So I also think that we can get smarter, thinking like an ecosystem. With this eco-mind, we can get a whole lot smarter about how to build our backbone. Because remember these mirror neurons? Think about the power they give us. We can choose people more courageous than we, people who are pushing that edge more courageously than we, and we can associate with them. And I love mentioning Deb Simpson, that waitress in Maine, right? She just went for it. And many, many other people, and I think of who I feel like I carry them with me. And so I think one thing we can say, why don't we make a pledge? Every week, we're going to find somebody more courageous than we. Either read about them, hang out with them, ask them to marry us, whatever. But the point is that we know how to change ourselves, in part because courage is contagious, just like everything else is contagious. So I think that's really cool. And so this is what I've come to call the missing ingredient. We're good enough, but we need more of what this thing is. I call it bold humility, and I've kind of explained to you the bold part. The humility part goes like this. The humility part is that it also gets easier with age. The humility part is realizing that when I came back from the journey with my daughter to Ride Hope's Edge, I thought, my goodness, every single thing that most excites me from this trip and in my life today, I would have given almost no chance of success when I was her age. That is really humbling. If I take that to heart, then, okay, for example, I can, just for example, would I've ever thought that here now that, that what was kind of wacky and counterculture of organic agriculture is now showing us a whole way, not only to help end hunger amongst small producers around the world, but is also and be part of the answer to climate change. I would have thought, oh no. Would have I imagined that I would have a little step-grandson who goes with me to the CSA? Would I have imagined a CSA? No way. And would I have imagined that last Halloween At 3 years old, he decided he wanted to be a farmer for Halloween. No way. This urban kid had only seen a female farmer. It was the only farmer he'd seen. So, and then my Ye of Little Faith was tested again, because of years ago I was in Leipzig, Germany, in a high school, and I saw this poster for Plant for the Planet. I looked it up, and the UNEP had set the goal of 1 billion trees a year in 2007. And my response was, wow, that's really ambitious. That's not going to happen. So I checked it last year. And do you know where they are now? I'll give you the punchline. In 2010, remember, it was going to be 1 billion a year for 3 years starting in 2007. Anybody know? We're over 10 billion trees worldwide that have been planted. And in Ethiopia, my favorite piece of this, 700 million trees planted. You know who was a big part of this? The Boy Scouts of Ethiopia. So what I'm suggesting then is that the humility piece of this bold humility is a realizing that if I was so wrong before, I could maybe be wrong again. So my conclusion is it's not possible to know what's possible. It's not possible to know what's possible. And if that's true, guess what? We're free. We're free to go for the world we really want. Thank you very much.
Francis consented to take a couple questions. So, questions out there? I have a hard time seeing. I think there's one over here. Well, maybe not. Well, I guess I don't see any questions. But I have the lights in my eyes, so. There you go.
10, 10, 10. What am I doing? What should I be doing?
I don't know. You want to explain?
You want to explain? Is that 350.org? Action?
Way back in the corner.
You want to explain? Thank you. Thank you. I will do something. I'm traveling, but I'm a big fan of 350.org and included it as an example in my book, Getting a Grip, as an example of living democracy. And so I honor you very much for what you're doing, and I'm going to go to my calendar right now and figure out what I'm doing on 10-10-10. And I encourage us all to do that as well. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
In your whole talk, you're talking about some of the differences between the kind of depression that you have seen in society as a whole. Do you feel that there's any differences between generations, such as the older generation, more people generation, and this younger, leisure generation?
Yes, I do, and I'm so encouraged. I'm encouraged, not directly answer your question, but part of what encourages me and lifts me up and is the partnership. I work with both of my children and other people younger than they, and I feel like it's so different from our generation where we just thought elders should be put out to pasture, And I don't get that, and I feel like we acknowledge that each has a powerful role to play. And I'm so excited about that. And I want more and more, to try to figure out how to make sure that my work is most useful to young people. I mean, people of any age, but I'm very excited by the can-do spirit and a level of sophistication and sort of being willing to really do the hard learning work. I feel, looking back on my 60s generation, for one, a lot of it was a protest, not entirely. There were a lot of positive elements, but I feel that this current youth generation is very focused on very practical, non-ideological, let's just get this done. And I love that spirit, and also very focused on the arts of democracy, as I point to in my book. I don't want to I took a lot of time, don't want to take a lot more, but really focused on learning the arts of democracy through communication training, like the nonviolent communication skills, and privileging that process just as much as the outcome. And I really want that to be known, how important that piece of the youth movement is. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's thank Francis one more
Thank
time.
you so much. Thank you, thank you.